this lecture, we're going to be talking about how to write and how to develop your theoretical and conceptual framework. So, in writing the theoretical and conceptual framework, why is this so important in the research? Because essentially, the frameworks themselves is actually our attempt to give an even more structured discussion in which the researchers will be able to develop their own expectations on the study as to how and why they need to read it. What are the certain parts they need to look for, and what is, of course, the general research design. So the theoretical and conceptual frameworks are very much different in terms of providing designs and orientations in which the researcher took in order for him to develop the research study. So, going into the topic of it, let's go to expounding what are the differences of theoretical and conceptual framework. Well, one thing is for sure, and by the way, this is the only thing I think that would be necessary in terms of providing you with the major differences of theoretical and conceptual frameworks. So, the theoretical framework in itself is the written framework, and the conceptual framework is, of course, the imagery of the concepts or the underlying concepts that may be expounded further in the study. So, to further, in the theoretical framework, aside from it being appearing as a written format, it also appears as an elaboration of additional core authors. Again, I'd like to stress the idea of the core authors. So, which among those are qualified in terms of being provided with the core authors? Let us remember the hierarchy of the most reliable references. Of course, at the very top most of it, we have the early stage materials in the very first part. The second part, of course, is the indexed publications. Third one, of course, is the articles and journals. And lastly, the books. So, ultimately, in terms of developing the core authors for the theoretical framework, we only make use of two major references, which is the early stage material and, of course, the indexed publication. So, the early stage material may be referred to classic philosophers, classic academics, classic researchers, the very classics that has not existed between the 20th and the 21st century. So ultimately, these ideas can be used as your core authors. And the index publications, by the way, are the authors that derive from the early research materials, similar as to how Plato derives from Sophocles. So the idea of doing so is that the core authors actually provides you with an even more reliable bedrock in terms of providing authors, in terms of providing relevant viewpoints that has come from experienced academics themselves. Why is this so important? Simple. It actually is a manifestation on how wide your research study, or how wide is the reading collection provided by your research study. And the more references that you have, the more reliable your researches can be. So that's one thing. So again, the theoretical framework is the written framework itself. While in total contrast to that, let's go to the conceptual framework. The conceptual framework is by far the imagery of the concepts, as said earlier. Now, let me go into even more specific details about that, because the conceptual framework, aside from it being the imagery of concepts, what concepts do we actually highlight in the conceptual framework? Simple. It comes from the researcher per se. And the theoretical framework, as you have already noticed, comes from supporting authors. So, the supporting authors take the majority of the written framework. And now, the conceptual framework provides the researcher's actual concepts in which he or she wants to elaborate in the study. So, the conceptual framework is all about the researcher's viewpoints. So, the theoretical, the integration rather of the theoretical and the conceptual framework is actually the combination of the author's viewpoints and how the researcher relies from the author's viewpoints and turns it into something new, which is by far the very nature of qualitative research. So, when making something new, or essentially when making something totally out of the ordinary, we actually need to compare our viewpoints as the researchers to those who actually did the research in the first or earlier times, in order for us to prove that our data is up to date and therefore not necessarily repeating just another research that most probably has already been written. So that's one thing that we need to orient ourselves into when writing the theoretical and conceptual framework. We also make use of these frameworks in terms of explaining our own points of view. Now, let me elaborate further on how to write the concept, or how to develop, rather. We don't write the conceptual framework, we develop the conceptual framework. So the conceptual framework is the image representation of the concepts, and we need to be aware of most of these elements. We need to be aware of the following. So, the conceptual framework consists of highlighting the following elements. First, you need to orient the respondents or the informants of the study. They need to be at the first and the topmost consideration in terms of developing the conceptual framework. So, in making the respondent, you identify who will be the beneficiaries or the direct beneficiaries of the research itself. Who will be those whom you will be directly addressing in terms of writing the conceptual framework. So we go first to the respondent, then afterwards we go to either the methodology or the approach in which you want to interpret the respondent to. Let's say for example that this person or this respondent is rendered as a student. Let's put him as a student. Now, after writing that he or she as a student, let's say for example that the methodology we want to use or the approach that we want to use is that we want to expose the student into the following food groups, which is of course the grow, go, and glow foods. So let's say for example that we're already aware of the methodology of doing so. Let's say for example that we're already aware of the methodology or the approach of orienting the respondent to it. Now, let's go to the last part, the output. The output, of course, is the expected outcomes of the research or the development of ideas that may be discussed in the research. So let's say, for example, the respondent student is able to expose himself to the following basic food groups, the go, grow, and glow foods, eventually will benefit from the output of health, the output of being health, the output of well-being, and others like that. So, as simple as that, we could already develop a conceptual framework based on the following elements. The respondent, the methodology and the approach, and of course, the output. So, of course, while doing this, we actually need to make sure that it is in line with our theoretical framework. Why? Because a proper integration of the theoretical and conceptual framework leads to the idea of consistency. We have to be consistent with the concepts, we have to be consistent, and of course, find ways to support our claims through using relevant references in order for us to determine ourselves as those who actually know what they're talking about, to actually render ourselves as knowledgeable in terms of what we want to actually research about. So, again, that's the idea of writing the theoretical and conceptual framework. If you have any comments about this lecture, please do not hesitate to leave a comment down below. I will try my very best to respond to all of your concepts. And furthermore, if you found this video is actually helpful for you, please do not hesitate to share this video, and do not forget to leave a like for this video as well as to subscribe. So, thank you very much. Stay safe and sanitary.